It's looking at 3 different sectors. It's looking at sport, it's looking at business, and it's looking at education. And I think it is different in the sense that it's the first time we've asked the question, well, what does high-performance leadership look like in schools? And is it the same in other sectors? So it's a cross-sector study. And what I'm going to share with you is some of these sort of initial thoughts, findings, reflections on the study. Now, we had enormous difficulty getting some of the business sites because of the commercial sensitivity. And I guess the first time that I recognized that we're very fortunate in education, to me to be an educational researcher, because I can get access to schools and districts, whereas getting access to some of these sites proved to be difficult. Andy and I spent many hours on planes randomly talking to people in case they had links into any of these, you know. And what do you do? And where do you work? Because, you know, there's a whole methodological paper there on how you gain access to sites that, A, there's commercial sensitivity about, or in the sports field, you know, is incredibly competitive and secretive. But we were fortunate. It took us quite a long time. But there's some of our sites. Fiat is a motor company, as you know. Used to be called Fix It Again Tony because of the number of times the company went into near liquidation. Cricket Australia. You know, it was so frustrating. Andy and I were the only people from England who were praying that cricket would retain that Australia would retain the Ashes. England won the Ashes, by the way. Shoebuy.com is the largest .com company selling shoes online. I don't know about you, but I just randomly, there's a gender divide in this room. Hands up those people who buy shoes online. Come on, be honest. Yeah. Okay, well, to me it's counterintuitive, but apparently a lot of people buy their shoes online, and handbags and accessories, and Shoebuy.com is the largest, one of the largest companies selling shoes online. The one you can't see very well is Marks & Spencer. Do you know who Marks & Spencer are? You see, we did that in America. They didn't know who they were. Andy's mother worked at Marks & Spencer's, apparently. Now, in terms of the sites and the allocation of sites, because we went in and collected data, right? So if you look at those sites now, I went to Marks & Spencer's and Andy went to Cricket Australia. So what was happening there, methinks? We both went to Fiat, and it was interesting. It was in Turin, which, again, if it sounds romantic, it wasn't. It was in the sort of industrial end of Turin that you really wouldn't want to go in at night time. And one of the interesting things about, you know, your images of leadership are challenged when you look at different sectors, okay? One of the things you had to do as you went into these different sectors was you had to avoid stereotyping. You had to avoid taking in your prejudices. But I have to say, in Fiat, when I found that every single member of the leadership team was male, and there were 22 people in the leadership team, I did ask the question, do you have any female leaders in this organization? Only to be told, yes, she comes in on a Wednesday. I kid you not. So as we were there on Thursday and Friday, I didn't get to see the female leader, but I was reassured that there was one in some cupboard somewhere. What we're finding from the study, and let me just sort of share with you some of the initial thoughts, is, you know, each of the sites, including our school sites, faced an acute challenge, faced almost oblivion in many respects. And it wasn't the nature of the challenge that was important, it was their response to the challenge. It was the way the leaders in those organizations responded to that challenge. And this notion of fight back, you know, they were very determined that this wasn't going to unsettle their organization. You know, Marks & Spencer's being taken over by another company was not going to happen in Stuart Rose's view. It just wasn't non-negotiable. You know, it was not going to happen. This notion of an absolute focus on one goal. And I think this is important to remember, because the problem is, with a lot of educational change, not only do we get multiple initiatives, we get multiple goals. And I think I'm with Michael Fulham where he says, focus on one thing as well as you can, and focus on everything else as well as you did. Because you can't, there is an inverse relationship between the size of the school development plan and what happens in practice. Yeah. Just writing those plans isn't good enough. Having 24 targets is not going to change classroom practice. But having one goal, hopefully with a very strong moral purpose behind it, can make the difference. And this point about widely distributing leadership, we saw different forms of distributed leadership in our organizations, and I was largely reassured, for reasons that would be pretty obvious, that distributed leadership is not just a phenomenon within education, it actually translates over to other sectors too. Now, one thing that seems to be contradictory and is coming out in the data is, a lot of the leadership work polarizes different types. So you're either charismatic or you're distributed. You're either autocratic or it's shared. It's either top-down or distributed. And what we're seeing in these organizations is what we're calling a leadership fusion, a fusion of different approaches. And it's back to the situational leadership or contextual leadership, the right leadership style for the right stage of the organization. In England, if you are a failing school, you're put into what's called special measures, which is a sort of punitive arrangement. Now, if you're a school in special measures, the last thing you want is widely distributed leadership. You need somebody to take hold of that school and to be clear and have a direction for it. So it's not about one type of leadership is good, another type is bad, one is opposite to the other. It's about the amalgam of leadership practices that suit that organization at the stage of its development, in its context. It seems to me that in making the connections back to that very first question, we need to recognize that certain forms of leadership are now inadequate in our changing world. And I think one of those is the sort of top-down model, the hierarchical model of leadership. And Sanjay talks about that. So my central argument really is twofold. That we need a shift towards leadership of learning, not leadership of organizations, but leadership of learning. And we need to see leadership much more as practice rather than role and responsibility. I just want to say a few things to close about, distributed leadership. And I think, again, this is where there's a real connection between networking and network leadership and distributed leadership, because essentially that's what a network is, shared leadership practice writ large. What sort of leadership do we need to ensure that every learner can walk the stage with dignity, with purpose, and with options? Well, I think we need leadership and leaders that have a very clear vision and sense of direction and moral purpose. And they do not waver from that moral purpose and sense of direction when other things come on them, when there are mandates for this, or there are policies for that, or there are initiatives that make no sense. The second thing is this notion of transparency and accountability. Yes, we need transparency, but we also need teachers to be accountable, we need schools to be accountable. But let's be clear about where the locus of accountability lies. Dick Elmore talks about the importance of internal accountability. The schools, in a sense, offering challenge and support to themselves, not relying on outside measures to set the goals. So internal accountability. We need, and this Stephanie mentioned this, and if there's only one book you read, and it's not by Harris or Kaiser or Halbert, unfortunately, although you can read those as well, they're pretty good. Stephen Covey Jr. has written a book called The Speed of Trust, and maybe you've already read it. Why I think it's important is because it reminds us that high-performing organizations are high-trust organizations, but also high-risk organizations. And you don't get high risk in innovation with high trust. His argument is the higher the level of trust, the quicker the speed of change in the organization. The lower level of trust, the lower the speed of change. The work on ineffective schools shows categorically that those ineffective schools are ineffective for one reason and one reason only. It's not because they have bad teachers. It's not because they have bad kids. It's because they have dysfunctional relationships and they mistrust each other fundamentally. But also I think it comes back to this notion of sustaining networks of professional practice. We need those networks more than ever. We need our professional connections more than ever. In this brave new world, there are going to be some big challenges. And as a profession, both in BC, in Wales, across the world, we have to hold our nerve and not waver from the moral purpose. We'll be encouraged to do so. I absolutely firmly believe that. So in sustaining networks, we have to recognize we're moving through different phases and that we're moving to a position where, we want to sustain those networks over time. And I haven't got time to go into that diagram, and that means that I fundamentally don't understand it. But I think that was Michelle's diagram, so ask her some questions about it.